For today, on this rainy Friday, we have a raid update. Because we have gone through another 10 or so days of 10.2.5, where we now take a look at the performance so far of the specs in the raid. Also, a needed recap to adjust some of the rankings being put by things like tier lists that you might take a look around sometimes when you're interested in taking a peek at which specs are doing well in the raid. You might be looking at stuff like this, for example, and it's time to adjust. It's time to correct some of these results in case some of you might get baited into believing some of these specs are much stronger than they actually look like, because the majority of these tier lists and rankings you might be seeing are done quite lazily, and when I say lazily, I mean they are basically ranked by popularity. As you can see, this is ordered by popularity, and as you can see, the tier ranking is basically matching their popularity. There is a couple of upside down ones, but the rest is basically line for line based on their popularity. Same goes here. The popularity is matching their ranking, right? So you end up having confusing things like Balance Druid. Balance Druid has been a solid, staple A tier spec according to tier list for the entirety of this raid. However, reality tells us that Balance Druid is shit, right? That's what reality is telling us in the damage done in Mythic to all the bosses. Even if you look at the actually good Balance Druid players, here's the 90 percentile results, and Balance is still doing terribly. Now, what you might be saying is, well, what if this list, or for example these rankings, are weighing, they are valuing the harder bosses more? Because it makes sense, right? Would you rather be a top DPS in the first 6 and be terrible in the last 3? Or would you rather be a top DPS for the last 3 fights but being mediocre to bottom half to bad in the first 6? So maybe Balance ends up being high in the rankings because they're actually doing very well in the bosses that matter. Well, here is Smolderon, where Balance Druid is not doing well whatsoever. Maybe they can turn it around for Tindral, right? It's big AoE, no, never mind. Tindral is also terrible for Balance Druid. But in the end, we all know the most important boss is the last one, right? So if you actually are a Chad doing super well on Ferak, then you no. Balance Druid is the worst DPS in the game outside of Augmentation on Ferak. So Balance Druid is basically the worst DPS of the last 3 bosses in the raid, and it has no business being here whatsoever. So this is a bait. Don't believe Balance Druid actually being a good spec. They should be down here with the rest of the clowns in terms of raid performance. We can give some credit based on these results. We can give some credit on a spec that is suffering the opposite fate of Balance, which is Arms. Because when you look at the results, Arms is in the bottom. Arms is not being given any credit in terms of damage when you look at the rankings, because their popularity is low, it's weak. They can barely beat Elemental, right? So it's not doing too well. But then you look at the results and Arms is in the top half. We can give them the same treatment as Balance, right? We look at Smolderon, Arms is top 6, top 7. We can look at Tindral, which has tons of AoE and cleave damage, whatever. Arms is doing poorly. But then you go back to Ferak, and Arms is the top 3 spec. So they are in the top 6 of Smolderon and in the top 3 of Ferak. So in 2 of the 3 last bosses, they are doing very well. And not just that, because if we go back to Nimue, Arms is again in the top 5. If you go to Larodar, Arms is in the top 5. If you go to Council, which isn't even a positive one for Arms, Arms is in the top 8. If you go down to Volkoros, Arms is in the top 5. So basically, looking at all of the results, Arms is doing very well. Even better in 2 of the last 3 bosses. They have no business being put so low, being considered so low if you take into account their throughput, their damage. That's one thing we can notice on the results of this recap. Balance is a fraud and shouldn't be ranked so highly in the tier list, and Arms is actually much better than it looks like from the tier list, and it should be rated much higher, more in line with their damage right now. However, it's not always like this. It's not that if you are low in the rankings, then you need to stay low, and if you're high in the rankings, then you need to be ranked high. Because we have an example right here, Affliction Warlock. Affliction has been the top performer in this raid for quite a few weeks now. It kept being put on average quite high. And then you look at the rankings, and for once, the rankings don't get baited by this for a wrong reason, of course. The reason why Affliction is down here is because they are the least played spec. So, because of their super low popularity, they are slammed at the bottom. Which, of course, at first glance, if you don't understand the reasoning, it makes no sense. Because look at their damage. Their overall damage is supposedly much higher than the S tier BM. You can change the ranking and not much is going to change. 281,000 dead last, when they are easily beating the top 3. Why? Because their popularity is the lowest one. However, they're not here because they are unpopular. They shouldn't be here because they are unpopular. As we have proven with arms, even if they are unpopular, their damage is very good. They are here because of padding, right? They are here because their top results right now are on Council with spread.cleave, and they are here because of Tindral with the damage done to the roots. We can have a better imagery of the rankings of Tindral by looking at the Tindral results, and you will find that all of the top logs are gonna be taken up by Affliction or by Demo. And the result is going to be more or less the same. You look at the damage done to the enemies, you look at Fiery Vines, and this is the damage done to the Fiery Vines. 240,000 DPS out of a total of 450. So basically more than half of your damage will come from the Vines damage on Tindral as an Affliction Warlock, right? That's the only reason why they rank so highly. Because when you move over to Ferak, Affliction is middle of the pack, slightly above top half. If you go back to Smolderon, pure single target, Affliction is at the bottom. If you go to Nimue, Affliction is second last, or last, because augmentation doesn't exist here. And then you have Larodar, where Affliction is again towards the bottom. And then you go to Volcaros, where Affliction is once more towards the bottom. So in this case, you have a high result Arms Warrior with low popularity, and a high result Affliction with low popularity. The difference though is that this one is legit. This low popularity doesn't matter, their results are actually good. In the case of Affliction though, their low popularity, they're not legit. Their high damage is just a couple of bosses spiking up their average, so it makes sense for them to stay at the bottom even if their average number is high. Now, besides the low popularity, are there some high popularity frauds besides Balance? We have already outed Balance as being a fraud despite their high popularity, not actually doing nearly as well in terms of performance and not deserving to be so high in the rankings. What about the others? Fury, Demo, Havoc, Ret, and BM. This one is harder to gauge because boss by boss they have a much more up and down set of results. For example, BM on Ferak is the 4th worst spec in the game. While at the same time, Fury is amongst the best, Demo is amongst the best, Havoc is amongst the best, while Ret is middle of the pack. And then you move down to Tindral, Demo continues doing well. Now Beast Mastery suddenly is in the top together with Havoc, now it's Ret who is middle of the pack, and it's Fury who is in the bottom half. And then you move over to Smolderon, pure single target. Now it's Ret and Fury who are doing very well, and it's Demo and Havoc who are in the middle of the pack. You go back to Nimue, and now Ret is first, Fury is still doing well, Demo and Havoc are at least middle of the pack, BM is above them. Back to Larodar, you have again Ret and Fury and Havoc doing well, Demo is still above the top half. So as a whole, the top 5 are not nearly as much of a fraud than Balanced Druid. At least they do have more or less good results throughout all of the bosses. Sometimes they alternate, sometimes it's Demo who's the best, and Fury who is average, sometimes it's Fury and Ret who are the best, and BM who is average, but overall these are more believable positions in terms of top results compared to Balanced Druid. Now there is another fraud watch in the DPS of the raid. Because if you look at the throughput, at the pure damage, without looking at the popularity, just at the damage, there is another one at the top. We have Demo, which we have already declared to be genuine, and then Affliction, which we have already declared to be a fraud. In the middle though, there is Sub. Sub, even here, 240, easily ahead of all of these. very high damage. In fact, the highest number you will find here is the one belonging to Sub. Now, is this also a fraud? Is this also a cheat? Right now, in the all bosses, they are actually first. They actually do have the highest damage overall. Well, it starts well, because even from the meme bosses like Nullroot, tons of funnel damage as well, Sub is doing very well. Igira also does have some pretty good amount of funnel for Sub Rogue to do more single target damage. Sub is doing very well. Volcaros is pure single target, doesn't matter, Sub is still first. Then you have a pause where you move into mediocrity, where on Council, Sub is in the bottom half, and then you move over to Larodar, Sub is also again in the bottom half. Back to Nimue, Sub is second place. Smolderon, Sub is easily first. Tindral, tons of add, tons of cleave, Sub is still top half, top 7, top 8. And then lastly Farak, where Subtlety is doing, middling results, but on Farak really what matters is the damage done to the bosses, which is why Sub is here, to just do single target damage. So actually, yes, it's a believable ranking to be right below the top, perhaps even at the top. Perhaps the reason why tier lists have not put Sub above them, have not made them bridge the gap, is due to their popularity still being slightly lower than the top results right now. But in terms of actual damage results, yes, Sub is doing well and is a genuine result in here. It's not fake, okay? It's not a fraud like Affliction or a fraud like Balanced Druid, right? It's actually a more believable power level for Subtlety, like Demo and Ret and Havoc, unlike Affliction or Balanced Druid. Now, the last of our fraud watches is gonna be Frost Death Knight. Because once more, if we list not by popularity, following the tier list exactly, but if we list them by DPS, you can see the tier list going all wacky. A, C, S, B, A, C, A, B, C, right? One was Affliction, which we ousted. Then you have Balanced Druid, which we ousted for being terrible in the A tier. What about though? What about Frost DK? Why is the damage so high? Why are they matching Demo and Havoc that we have just seen doing very good damage overall throughout all of the bosses? Even here, the overall damage is okay, seems to be quite healthy damage. We, again, are more interested in the harder bosses, so on Farak, they are doing pretty well. On Tindral, plenty of AoE opportunities, they are doing pretty well. On Smolderon, pure single target, they do worse. If you go further down, you have Nimue, bottom half, you have Larodar, middle of the pack, you have Council, Spread, Cleave, Fight, doing terribly. On Volcaros, back to pure single target, short fight, which is good for Frost DK, doing very well. And then the meme bosses, Igira, middle of the pack, and then Nullroot, middle of the pack. So at the very least, in case of Frost DK, being middle of the pack average is okay. It's a decent result. So even in here, this result perhaps is a bit harsh for Frost DK, being put at the very bottom. Once more, the reason for that is because if we list it back by popularity, Frost is doing badly. So that's why they get lumped in here. They shouldn't be here, okay? They shouldn't be here. They should be around here. Around average result at the moment. Definitely not slammed at the bottom because they are unpopular. The results are showing that even if they are unpopular, their performance is overall good. We can finish the last of the fraud watch with something in reverse. We have just looked at another one of the low tier list placed specs with a higher than average damage, and we concluded that they are being discriminated against because they are unpopular, but their damage is actually better than their ranking would suggest. The opposite would be for Frost Mage, because once more, if we check the damage, why are you so low? You are dangerously close to Balanced Druid, another spec we have ousted as being a fraud for being ranked so highly because he is popular. Frost Mage, while not nearly as popular as Balance, it is still in the top 10 of most popular specs, even above Fire, who is doing significantly better than Frost. So why? Why is Frost showing up so highly in the rankings, in the tiers, even though their results supposedly are pretty bad? We start by checking what's most important first, which is the result in the harder bosses. Frost Mage is top half at the very least when it comes to Farak. Frost Mage is again top half when it comes to Tindral. Actually, that's disingenuous. It's not top half, it's top 6 when it comes to when it comes to Tindral, and when it comes to Smolderon, okay, Frost Mage is second to worst. So, as long as there is some AoE, some extra targets to slam, Frost Mage is doing well. As soon as you go to pure single target like Smolderon, Frost Mage goes all the way down. So Nimue, by the same logic, still has Frost Mage at the very, very bottom. Lardar, you do have some adds available in there, so Frost Mage starts doing a little bit better. Council, more targets to hit, Frost Mage does a little bit better, back to a pure single target fight, and Frost Mage goes back to being terrible. So, okay, we get the message. We get the message, as long as there is more than one target to hit, Frost starts doing slightly better. As long as there aren't though, it does much worse. So for a spec that is so polarized on doing well exclusively on multiple targets and nothing else, being put so high in the rankings is, I would constitute it as a fraud. I think they shouldn't be as highly rated as Subtlety, as we have just seen in the results, as highly rated as Fury, Enhancement, Fire Mage. I think that's a bit too high for Frost's standards. They should be lower down, definitely not above, for example, as we just saw, something like Arms Warrior. So we have uncovered yet another fraud in terms of results when it comes to the current performance of the specs in the raid. I think this is a good experiment to have whenever we check our weekly recap of results, because it might help some players get a better idea of how the specs are actually performing. You know, sometimes you just want to look at the results, so you're like, oh, I guess Affliction is very good, when in reality they are not, and for once the tier list is correct. So you stick to the tier list and you're like, oh, I guess Balance is very good, but Balance Druid is not good. But then you remember, hold on a second, why is Frost DK in the middle with BM? If I just looked at the tier list and BM was in the super S tier and Frost DK was not. So checking out the actual performance of these specs, regardless if you are trusting a tier list or if you're trusting the just flat numbers on Warcraft logs, it can help. It can help oust some of the frauds being given too much credit, like Affliction Warlock on the meters, or like Frost Mage and Balance Druid on the tier list, or the reverse. Specs like Arms Warrior not being given too much credit, even Frost DK not being given too much credit, for example. So that's the recap on the current situation in the raid and the performance of the specs so far in the raid when it comes to DPS performance. So that's the TLDR on this Friday on how the specs have been performing so far in the raid. Of course, no major groundbreaking nerfs or buffs coming up this week or next week to be talking about. So I'm going to leave you to the rest of the beginning of your weekend for today. Thanks, of course, as usual, to everyone who is supporting via Patreon and to everyone who is doing it for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. So, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, do you guys hear it? Hold on, the sound, the calming sound of rain. That's nice.